To the University of California, San Diego, Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. We are here today to discuss the economy. Before we do that, let me just give you a bit of information about where we are, who we are, and why we're here. You are at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. We offer 7 degree programs, including a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. We also have a Japan Center called JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology, which was set up several years ago in an effort to connect San Diego and Japan and create a forum for exchange on things Japan. You can get information about these places at gps.ucsd.edu and jfit.ucsd.edu. Our Japan Forum has a weekly webinar series, and in the off chance that I don't have a chance to announce this later, coming up next week, we will talk about innovation and entrepreneurship, followed by a discussion that I will have with Steph Haggard from our faculty on business reinvention. We'll then talk about trade, religion, culture, and many more to come. Join us on Tuesday afternoons at 4:30, which is 8:30 Wednesday mornings, Tokyo time. Let me just go then to today's agenda. I have 2 wonderful guests today, Professors Robert Feldman and Takeo Hoshi, and I will introduce them now momentarily. Let me just give you a little bit of background on what's going on in Japan. So here's a slide that shows the development of the COVID situation in Japan. The red are the current cases, people that are affected, blue are people that have recovered, and yellow are the people that have passed away due to the virus. As you can see, the numbers are very small, which is an interesting question in and of itself compared to, say, the United States. Japan's experience here was briefly that the first case happened in late January. Then there was a self-restraint, sort of a modified lockdown that came into effect late February. The government took several measures, changed the special emergency law. In late March, the governor of Tokyo, the mayor of Tokyo, Koike, announced that please everybody should stay home. And this sort of more severe jishuku, self-restrained, stay at home advisory is still there today in the large metropolitan areas and has recently been lifted in the countryside. So there are a number of questions here. For instance, regarding the economy, what will this mean? Japan is a very heavily export-dependent economy with global supply chains, interactions that are now on hold. The news yesterday was that technically Japan is in a recession. How should we assess these news? Certainly, the massive relief package of 20% of GDP will further increase non-performing debt and possibly non-performing loans. And yet, all of Japan's core data look comparatively strong, whether that's employment, corporate cash holdings, and other matters like that. So today, here with me are my 2 colleagues from Tokyo, Professor Robert Feldman, who is a professor at the Tokyo University of Science and the senior advisor to Morgan Stanley MUFJ Japan. For the last 30 years, Robbie has been the best known and most prominent chief economist in Tokyo in the large investment banks, and he has informed our thinking of Japan in many, many different ways and continues to do so. He has a book coming out on the future of the economy in Japanese it is. It's soon to be there, and Robbie will tell us all about it. I will invite him to talk first, and then he will be followed by Professor Takeo Hoshi, who many of you know very well, because Takeo was a professor at GPS here at UC San Diego from 1988 until 2012. He just reminded me that he left his GPS office, which was right next to mine, in December 2012 when the Abe administration launched. Takeo has since left Stanford and is now a professor of economics at the University of Tokyo. He has a new book out called The Japanese Economy, which is the title of our conversation today. So thank you both for joining me. It's terrific to have you here. And so, Robbie, could I ask you to begin your presentation, and then we'll invite Takeo to follow.
Thank you very much, Ulrika. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here today. And I hope the short comments that I have might help inform our discussion. If I may, let me share a screen here and get started on our discussion. So what I want to talk about today is the disease, the economy, and the future. So let me start out a bit more on the disease. Ulrika just gave us a very nice slide with data on the disease in Japan. Let me augment that just a touch with some data on various countries around the world. These data come from the Johns Hopkins site, the one down at the bottom here. Basically, what these data are showing across countries is that Japan has done quite well relative to other countries. For example, compare Japan and Sweden. Sweden has about 10 million people in the population. Japan has 127 million, and yet the number of confirmed cases in Sweden is double the number in Japan. Now, there may be some issues about how Japan measures cases, but still it's a pretty good performance. I would point out here that even though Japan may be underestimating cases basically due to the way things are counted, etc. Even if Japan had 10 times the number of cases relative to what's out there, it would still be lower in terms of cases as a percent of the population than other industrial countries. So in that sense, Japan has done quite well. Same is true in terms of this. So Japan has done quite well. You look at the curve on cases in Japan, and it is definitely flattening out here. Just a little technical note, I put the scale here in terms of a base 2. So each line in the graph, the next line up implies a quadrupling of the numbers. But the point here is that the slope of the line tells you how fast things are growing. And Japan's line right here, as you can see, has flattened out a great deal. The same is true with this. So Japan has actually done pretty well. How do we explain this? This is another very interesting and difficult question, but the framework I'd like to use comes from a biomathematician who works in London. He's at one of the London schools. I think it's the School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, a place like that. Very, very, very good book he's put out called The Rules of Contagion. Adam Kucharski is his name. It's a very easy to understand model. And he focuses on this number R0, or R0 as they say, the number of people that an infected person subsequently infects. We're all becoming much more familiar with this now. If R0 is above 1, then each infected person brings more than one other infection, and the disease grows quickly. If R0 is less than 1, then the disease will peter out over time. Now, what Professor Kucharski has done here is break down R0 into 4 elements or 4 determinants that help us understand whether we're doing a good job or not. He calls this the DOTS model, for D-O-T-S. D is the number of days that an infected person is infectious to other people. In the case of this disease, the assumption is it's 14 days. Not much the policy can do about that. However, on OTS, it's a different story. O is the number of people that an infected person meets per day. Okay? So if everybody's out riding the subway and you're an asymptomatic carrier, you're going to meet a lot of people. That's probably not a good thing. So one thing one way to reduce R0 is to reduce that number O, the number of people an infected person meets every day, okay? Quarantines, etc. T, this is the probability that an infected person transmits the disease. Now, each infected person will not transmit the disease to everybody they meet. There's a sneeze factor. If you're standing next to someone who's got the disease on a train and they sneeze on you, then there's a problem. But not everybody in the train car is going to be exposed to that. So this T is a probability that the infected person transmits the disease. And then finally, there's the recipient side. This is a probability that the disease actually makes the recipient sick. So for example, if the sick person on the train sneezes on you, but you are immune, then there's not a problem. So that's the S part. Now the question here in terms of analyzing Japan is, what has Japan done in terms of lowering the O, T, and S numbers? And there's a lot of good news on that. In terms of the O part, I think that Governor Koike's actions, partly also prior to that, Prime Minister Abe with his school closed down, but then after the national emergency, that actually had a major effect on lowering the O, the opportunities, the number of people met. In addition, the Japanese people are cooperative. We don't have demonstrations in the street here blocking hospitals because people want to move around. So the innate cooperation of Japanese culture has actually helped lower the O as well. On T, the transmission probability, there we've got pretty good hospitals. We've got a good allocation of hospital beds. There's triage in who gets into the hospitals, who doesn't, which I think has actually been an important factor. And finally, on the S, on the susceptibility, the things like immunization, although that has not happened yet because there's no vaccine yet, but basically hygiene habits are also quite important. People wash their hands, people gargle, people bow instead of shaking hands. There's some cultural aspects to this, but Japan, for both cultural and personal hygiene reasons, has a pretty low level of S. So those are the reasons I would say that Japan has done, better than some other countries. So now let me move on a little bit to the economy. This is the Morgan Stanley outlook for the global economy. And it's a very simple chart that compares where we expect the global GDP of the G10, the overall GDP of the G10 countries put together, to move over the next couple years. And we're comparing that here to the global financial crisis of 2008. Okay? The GFC in the orange or the yellow, I guess, line here took a long time. It was deep, but it wasn't nearly as deep as this. Okay? That said, this time we are probably going to get back to the pre-COVID level of GDP quicker than we did in 2008 crisis, but still that is at the end of next year. So that's a pretty long time frame on this. Yes, we are expecting something like a V-shaped recovery over the next quarter or two. Even in the US, we're seeing some reopenings. That's happening in Japan as well. But the point there is not the bounce back, it's the pace after the bounce back. And even that we see as relatively weak. For Japan, if you draw the same graph for Japan, our current forecast actually has Japan recovering the pre-COVID level of GDP only in 2022. As Ulrika mentioned before, we do have an economy that's much more export-oriented, and so any disruptions in the global economy, more trade disruptions as may happen in US-China events right now, could also be a disruptive factor there. How is Japan doing? Well, I've just got some data here. Ridership in the Tokyo Toei subways is down some 70%, and I can vouch for that, as I sometimes have to go out for little things and ride around a bit. The trains are very empty. Even the Yamanote line is very empty. Machine tool orders, they're still down about 40%. It's not getting any worse, but down 40% year on year is a pretty hefty decline. Okay. Another thing important, there has been some easing of the national emergency. I think 39 prefectures now have had the national emergency lifted. A couple others seem to be on the way, but nevertheless, we still have about 50% of GDP in those 8 prefectures where the national emergency is still in effect. And so it's been a little bit slow in terms of moving back toward a lifting of the national emergency. So that's, I think, an important way to do it. You don't look at the number of prefectures, you look at the share of GDP in each of those prefectures. Tokyo will have to come down to about a total of 70 cases per week in order to meet one of the criteria for lifting that national emergency order, and we're not quite there yet. Okay? We're at about 139 compared to the goal of about 70. Okay? In early April, I went in and talked to a small committee at the LDP about what to do. And I would give the subsequent actions of the government sort of call it a B. They've done okay on a number of the items, and particularly the big fiscal support, the stay-at-home orders, things like that. Testing has not been successful really at all in terms of ramping it up. Even Prime Minister Abe a couple days ago said we have to do much better on that. And then on R&D and vaccines and things like that, they're pushing some, call it national champions on this, but we have not seen much movement in terms of reducing the legal risk of institutions that treat patients, things like that. So overall, I'd sort of give it a B. Now, what about the future? COVID itself is not the problem. The problem for the future of the Japanese economy is productivity growth. And here, I have one little chart to sort of illustrate things. If you look at this left-hand side, you see output equals output per worker times number of workers. GDP is actually up a fair amount since the start of Abenomics. But if you look at the productivity in terms of output per worker, it's hardly moved at all. So basically, we've had a lot of new workers come into the economy. This comes from Womenomics, from some other changes of the rules, and that's a great thing. But productivity has not been driving the economy since the start of Abenomics. It's been increased labor. Okay. Now, why is labor productivity stagnant? Basically, it's because of the 2 offsetting factors. Productivity per hour, the black line here, has actually done quite well. Not as well as it needs to do, but it's done okay. In contrast, the H over L part, the hours per worker, has been going straight down because there's so many more part-timers in the economy. So basically, we have more efficient use of time, but less time going in. It's going to be hard to support the economy if higher output per hour is offset by people working less and less and less. So we need to make sure that we're pushing that output per hour as high as we possibly can. This comes down to innovation. And this is one area where I think GPS has done a wonderful job in pushing forward our knowledge of how innovation works. What I've done here is use some of my work from Tokyo University of Science just to compare what innovation looked like, say, 30 years ago and what it looks like today. Basically, because of high information and search costs, there was a linear model of how innovation worked, from education to science to engineering to invention to entrepreneurship to business, finally to GDP. Now, because of this lowered information barriers, all of the elements can talk to each other all of the time. And this has been immensely helpful during the COVID crisis because scientists from all around the world are sharing their results much more actively, much more aggressively, so that we can speed up the development of new vaccines. This is the new model for how innovation works. What about Japan? Is Japan moving to this innovation model as fast as it should be? And the answer is, well, probably not. Particularly the policy coordination is what I'm worried about. What I've done on this final slide here is to look at the 15 major committees, or commissions rather, in the government. And as of spring last year, I looked at who's on the different committees to look for overlap. That is, are people talking to each other? Okay. There are 295 individuals on those 15 committees at that time. Only 14 of them served on more than one. And my perfect example of the problem here is that there's an industrial structure commission in the Ministry of Trade and Industry, 30 people on it. And I looked for the overlap between that Industrial Structure Commission and the Science and Technology Commission in the Ministry of Education. The overlap is 0. Okay? So if policy is being made in silos, you're not going to get the coordination effects that are necessary to have the speed of innovation that Japan will need to go back and raise that rate of innovation. So that's where I want to leave my remarks now, and we can go back to the comments of my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robbie. There's a great tour de force, everything you need to know and need to think about if you want to understand where we stand. So Takeo, let me turn to you and ask for your comments. Where's the economy going?
Okay, thank you, Ulrika. It's nice to be back at UCSD, although it's only virtually. And also, when I left, it used to be, it was called IRPS instead of GPS. But this panel discussion reminds me of something we did almost exactly 9 years ago. There was a panel discussion like this in a Robinson Auditorium, which I assume still exists, right? The topic then was a post-3/11 Japanese economy, and the topic today is a post-COVID-19 Japanese economy. So, and there are some similarity. So it reminded me of what we did 9 years ago. So let me share the screen with my slides, the slides I prepared. So I tried to look for the announcement or the website for that seminar 9 years ago, which I couldn't. This was the best I could do. This is a notice of the event that I was able to find in a UCSD newsletter. And this shows what we did 9 years ago. So this was a panel discussion moderated by Professor Krauss, who I guess has retired now. And both Ulrika and I were on the panel. And the situation was, in a sense, very similar to today. The economy had just got hit by a huge shock, and we were wondering what will happen now. Where is the economy heading? So, and this is what I said 9 years ago. So this is the argument I made. I literally lifted these remarks from my slide, so it doesn't fit today, but this is exactly what I said. So in the short run, output declines. As Robbie mentioned, this is what we expect to happen this time. But in the long run, in the short run, output decline. But in the long run, I claimed that the situation can be actually better. Japan could shift on to a higher economic growth path, or worse, Japan can stagnate for a long time. And I argue it depends on policy choice. And so this kind of echoes what a part of what Robbie mentioned in his slide. So the problem then was, so Robbie mentioned COVID is not a problem for Japan from an economic growth point of view. Productivity growth or slow productivity growth is. And that was exactly the situation 9 years ago as well. Earthquake wasn't so much a problem, but the productivity growth, which was low even before the earthquake was. And depending on what happens to the productivity growth, Japan could have gone on to a higher economic growth path or lower economic growth path. Now, what happened after the earthquake? Probably judging from what Robbie mentioned, Japan's adjustment after the earthquake wasn't that great from productivity growth point of view. Japan still suffers from low productivity growth. I haven't done a careful study, so I can't say now, but I have found an interesting paper, which is not about Japan, but on Italy. This paper by Baron and Mossetti compare two episodes of earthquakes in Italy that happened in 1980s, and then compare for those two cities what happened to the economic growth after the earthquake shock. So the two cities, one is called, I guess, Friuli, and the other one is Irpinia. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing those correctly. Friuli, they experienced the earthquake in 1976, and Irpinia 1980. So these two graphs shows what happened to the what happened to the growth of these two economies after these. So let me use a laser pointer here. So this is a point of earthquake for Friuli, and the other one is Irpinia. The earthquake happened in 1980. Then the solid line shows what happened to the growth since then. And the dotted line shows the counterfactual that they create by combining other similar cities. So compared with the combination of other similar cities called the synthetic, Friuli did quite well. And Irpinia did worse than it would have done if the earthquake didn't happen. So this shows two very different outcomes following the earthquake, and which is very similar to what I claimed 9 years ago. The economy can shift to a higher economic growth path, or can shift to a lower economic growth path. And what distinguishes these two cases? That's a very important and interesting questions, and I invite you to read these papers. But basically, the Friuli, after the earthquake, successfully changed their economic structure and increased the productivity growth. The TFP growth was quite high. And what happened in Irpinia is more political scandals and corruptions, and wasted the opportunity to change. So obviously, we are not looking at earthquake today, or a tsunami, or a nuclear disaster even. But my message today is basically the same. Or argument today is basically the same. In the short run, the economy declines after the disaster. So in that sense, this doesn't matter, pandemic or earthquake. Actually, it matters. One difference between pandemic and the earthquake is, in both cases, the recession happens. But in pandemic, the recession is a feature, not a bug. Because we need economic recession. We need shrinkage of the economic activities to reduce the speed of the flu spread to the economy, or flatten the curve, so to speak. So using the terminology Robbie mentioned, so we need to reduce all opportunities for the virus to spread. And the recession does that. So that's a feature. And in the long run, similar, again, I would expect the similar thing for the after the pandemic. It's possible for the economy to reach better growth paths if the economy can use these disasters as a trigger to change the economic system and change the economic institutions to increase the productivity growth. One of the lines possible is what Robbie implied in his talk. Or the economy can reach worse economic growth paths and continue to struggle. Okay. And we don't know which happens, and that probably depends on the policy choices, and so that's something the Japanese people get to choose. But I want to point out, I want to finish my portion of the speech by pointing out some promising changes in Japan that we are already seeing. In Japan, people have been talking about hatarakikata kaikaku, or work style reform and digital transformation and so on, with little progress or less progress than we would have wanted. But I think what's happening now is that those economic reforms that the people wanted are now going forward. Now many companies are forced to change, and many companies started to do remote working. Some companies like Duango and Chubu Gas have already announced that they will continue the practice of remote working even after the COVID-19 crisis subsides. So, and also I don't have to point out, but we have already moved to the world where online conference like this is a norm. We've been teaching online courses at the University of Tokyo since the beginning of the April as well. E-commerce and delivery services will permanently increase their shares. We have started to see some regulatory changes, which would stimulate economic growth. And also, I will stop here, but also I want to point out the possibility that we are also realizing the value of what we used to take for granted during this self-restraint period, such as the quality of services in restaurants in Japan. The problem for Japan was that those restaurants have a high level of services, but they couldn't get to convince the people to pay for those services. But now we realize those values, certainly at least I value those now much more than before. So it may increase profitability in the future for those industries as well. So people talk about omotenashi in Japan, but the problem of omotenashi was it didn't earn money. And now we may be able to move into the economy where omotenashi can be actually profitable. So let me stop here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Takeo. If you could unshare, that's great. So let's begin the discussion. We have some Q&A already, but I'm going to take the prerogative of the host here and ask you a first question, if I may. You made a lot of talked a lot about productivity growth and reflecting that you are MIT trained at PhDs in economics, and so you're upholding sort of what the important aspects of your profession. Let me challenge you a little bit on that. So productivity per worker in Japan is lower. Let me just stipulate this as a sentence, and you can push back on this, because Japan has overemployment, not because people don't do anything when they go to work, but because there is a strong preference in society to not be unemployed. And it also includes, of course, a large portion of these productivity measures of small companies, whether that's a tatami maker or a little noodle stand somewhere, or companies that, if you were just a hard-nosed economist, would say those are zombies and they should be closed down, but in the Japanese setting are kept alive, whether that's through loan programs or through whatever, in lieu of giving these people unemployment benefits. Let them go to work, let them open their store. So a large portion of at least the service sector is sort of a quasi-social welfare sector. So that if we wanted to measure productivity just in terms of being interested in how well Japanese workers work, we should divide the economy into these two separate portions. So that's one question. The second question is the pricing thing that Takeo brought up. I've always been under the impression that a lot of the price setting in Japan is still sort of bound by long-term trade relations, and can we raise the price and how much can we charge? And that too would affect the productivity measure, right? Because presumably we're measuring productivity in yen produced per person, right? The revenues or something. So can you highlight a little bit more why, why you're so concerned with productivity, and why I might be wrong in making up all of these excuses, if you wish, for why maybe we shouldn't look at productivity in the same way. Robbie, you want to start since you began? Yes, go for it.
Yeah, so I started this fight, so I'll have to take the next step.
We can't hear you. Can you speak up a little bit, or a microphone?
Sorry, okay, I have to lower the microphone, yeah. The first issue, I think, really has to, with productivity, has to do about the future of the economy. We have this aging society. And what aging society means is, yes, population will go down, but the working age population will go down even more. So the fewer and fewer remaining workers will have to produce more and more each in order to maintain any kind of, call it, reasonable social security system. Okay? Now, of course, you could have people working longer, which they are beginning to do, but the over 75 group begins to grow very, very quickly after 2023. And that means that the people in the lower age groups are going to have to be more and more and more and more productive in order to maintain any kind of called reasonable living standard for the economy as a whole. Okay, so that means the productivity for the younger folks basically is the sine qua non of maintaining social peace in the country. Now, I think one thing you're getting at is we maintain social peace by having a lot of called hidden unemployment. The economy as a whole sort of taxed itself to keep these guys employed. But once they're retired over 75, et cetera, that's not going to be possible anymore. And so we have to raise productivity, particularly for the younger folks, in order to maintain any kind of social cohesion. Okay. Now, how do we do that? There are a couple things that I think need to be focused on, but one of them, which I would push most, is R&D. The amount of spending on R&D in Japan as a whole is pretty high relative to other countries. However, looking at OECD statistics, it's a little bit skewed in favor of corporates away from other things. The other thing that I think is very important is not just the spending on R&D, but it's not R&D, it's RD&D, that is research, development, and diffusion. That is, the diffusion of technologies in Japan has been a little slower than it should be. So that's a part of it. The other thing you mentioned, pricing, which I think is very, very important on this, which is I still think that prices in Japan are adversely impacted, that is kept higher than they should be, by a lot of, call it monopolistic practices or regulatory practices. One of the reasons that the regional economies are not in such good shape is that it's expensive to live in the regions. There's some wonderful data from various ministries put it together that show that yes, yes, prices are lower in the regions, but they're not as low as wages are, which means that it's expensive to live outside of Tokyo, so people keep coming to Tokyo. And if you look at the population trends, what you see is that compared with the US, for example, the concentration of population in old population centers is higher and less mobile than it is in the United States. So if anything, I would think more aggressive deregulation would help us on the price front, help us in diffusing technology, and get the population a little better educated as well, to use the IT a little more effectively. And so that would raise the productivity and help maintain social peace. So that's the approach that I'm taking.
So before I turn to Takeo, let me just give you a little bit of pushback. I mean, you brought up the aging society. And so if my story is right, that a lot of the low productivity numbers is due to these old mom and pop stores that are artificially kept alive to save everybody's face and have people employed, they will also go away.
So there could be
the numbers could go better just through attrition.
I hope that's true, but there are a lot of large firms that aren't particularly productive either.
Yeah. Okay, Takeo, let's see what you have to add to that?
Okay, on prices, I think I disagree with Robbie, but I'd like to look at more data there. And in any event, I don't think the low price influences the productivity, because we look at we look at real productivity levels. So we use a price index to calculate the real output and divide that by input. So I don't think that's an issue for productivity. The price is issue for something else too. But low productivity, the problem of the low productivity or the zombie forms, as you mentioned. So there is an advantage of keeping zombies in that it provides more jobs for some people, to protect the employment. And that has been the policy choice of the Japanese government for a long time. So that was a policy to keep the cost of changes for many people. But the cost of doing that was a low productivity growth. If you can, I think there's a better way for make many people who lose a job today to move on to another jobs. The problem of protecting zombies is, as my research has been suggesting, that by keeping those human resources into unproductive companies, including the large ones, but many small ones, that it prevents other small companies or new companies, more productive companies to come into the economy, or more productive companies to expand, so that they can absorb some of the human resources or human capital, which could be released by these zombie companies. So as long as, so I don't think the Japanese policy, or the main Japanese policy of protecting those employment has been very successful in that sense. And low productivity is exactly the result of those policies, as you mentioned, and those policies are not efficient policy. And I think Japan can do better.
If I may, let me bring up one other thing, a very interesting piece of research that I saw out of the MIT Media Lab. A guy named Alex Pentland has written a book called Social Physics. And it's about how sort of productivity in teams works. He's a big data guy. And he's got some very interesting numerical work about how the intensity of communication within a team is, in his view, extraordinarily important, rather than the individual talents of the members. But the communication structure within the team is extraordinarily important in generating productivity. And actually, it was his work that triggered my little chart that I showed on the different committees. And what I'm asserting here is that the Japanese employment system, by keeping people in individual companies, that is the lifetime employment system, actually lowers the ability of the economy to transmit information and therefore raise overall productivity. So that's the approach that I'm taking to this.
So let me turn to some of the questions that we're getting from our audience. There are a number that I'm going to combine and shape them a little bit, if I may. Takashi Kobanava, our alum in Tokyo, is asking whether you expect any changes in global competitiveness out of Japan. And so let me couch this in some of the other comments we're getting. Takeo, you've been talking about the pandemic, the current pandemic, as an exogenous shock to the economy, and what can we predict, similar to an earthquake. And there are some questions around whether that's the right way of thinking, and if you could explain why that is, or reframe it in terms of Takashi's question. Is the trajectory that the Japanese economy going to take after COVID-19 similar to other exogenous shocks, whether that's an earthquake or something? Or is there something different this time about this being a pandemic rather than an earthquake or a war or a trade war or whatever. Is there something different around this, or can we just think of this as an exogenous shock that has happened, that is over? It's not over, right? So how can you guide our thinking around how to assess competitiveness and in the future and trade and the nature of the pandemic?
So I guess here we are talking about the competitiveness in terms of international competitiveness, and that may matter for export or net export. So both of you actually mentioned that Japan is an export-oriented economy, which is not true in the sense that the Japanese economy depends on export and import in terms of the level of GDP. The proportion of the trade in the level of GDP in Japan is probably as large as the US, much smaller than South Korea or Germany and many European countries. The problem for Japan was rather a dependence on export in economic growth.
Yes.
So even though the level of Japanese economy doesn't depend so much on export, but the growth comes from mostly from export. And that has been a problem for the Japanese economy. And if there's a COVID incidence, or if this crisis makes Japanese economy more domestic or depend on more internal demand, that may be actually a good change.
May I?
Please.
Thanks. I want to echo what Takeo has just said. It is the increment to GDP coming from exports that's the most important thing, what we call a high beta economy. But going back to Ulrika's questions, there are two things on competitiveness and the kind of shock. If you want to know about the true mechanism of competitiveness in the Japanese economy, the book you have to read is Ulrika's new book, which just came out. It's extremely good. And it gets a lot of information about how Japanese companies in a very quiet way have really done a great job in improving their global competitiveness. So it's certainly an important thing to take a look at. In terms of the shocks, I like to separate shocks into shocks to the supply curve and shocks to the demand curve, which are very different kinds of shocks. 1973 was a shock to the supply curve, oil, okay? And in that case, it took 5 years for business investment in Japan to return to its level prior to the first oil shock. Okay, the technology wasn't good enough at the time to start investing very quickly to create cheaper energy infrastructure. So it took a very long time. Contrast that situation with, say, the 2008 financial shock or the 1997 financial shock. Those were both basically demand shocks. And yes, they were deep and they were serious, but business investment came back relatively quickly compared to a supply shock. So then you get to the question, is this COVID a supply shock or a demand shock? Well, it's both. But initially, my view is that it's a supply shock that then caused a demand shock. And it's the speed of demand recovery that's going to be crucial to how the final result comes out. That said, in certain senses, it's very different from 1973 because we've got the technology available now to start investing very quickly again. This Zoom conference being a perfect example of that. So I'm not as pessimistic as, say, the 1973 shock because of the nature of technology that we have going in to this particular issue.
So in that sense, this is similar to earthquake, which was a supply shock.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that addresses a number of questions that we got. Why would you want to talk about an earthquake when we're talking about a pandemic? There is, of course, the uncertainty going forward, but that would also be true for an earthquake, right? Because there will always be another earthquake, I guess. We have a few questions that are about whether this particular moment in time will change trajectories as they pertain to immigration, tourism, the role of women. So there's this old adage, never let a good crisis go to waste. And we hear a lot about how this sudden shift to telework actually may be an opportunity to push the hataraki kata kaikaku, the work style reforms forward, because there's no more dilly-dallying around, people are now doing telework. But what does this really mean? I mean, is this going to set women back, or is this going to put women forward? Is this, are we going to see less immigration because we're now worried about the thing, or more immigration because we need more workers? So can you kind of look a little bit at the crystal ball, whatever your favorite topic of these topics is, and lay out a scenario of how this might go? Takia, may I call on you first? You had the handful in your slide.
So I don't have a crystal ball, or actually I have two crystal balls. The one and the other told me two different things, right? So all of those have different possibilities. And I think what happens depends on the choice that we make. So also you've been trying to let me say the earthquake and pandemic are different, and they are different. Especially the earthquake 9 years ago is obviously different from today's pandemic. And I think one important difference that we need to think about here is earthquake was just about Japan, or just about Tohoku, but now the pandemic is influencing all over the world. So in that sense, the 9 years ago, it was Japan's opportunity to change. Now I think the world has an opportunity to change. And if we go back, say 30 years now, I think many economies have failed to respond to many changes, like technological progress, globalization, things like that. I talked about Japan's response of protecting zombie farms. Didn't go well. The US response, which was more free market type of things, didn't go well either. And if we can come up with a better way to adjust to the changes through this crisis, the world will be a better place.
Robbie, do you? What's your vision there? I mean, is Japan going to grab this opportunity and really do something with it, or I mean, you're negative on the policy committees and the information exchange, but Japan is very slowly and quietly making some policy changes. So, for instance, immigration, there's yes. Japan started from zero, so the absolute numbers may not look that high, but if you look at the trend, it actually had started before all this happened. There was a pretty steady increase in immigration and the addition of new workers and so forth. Are these things going to be derailed, or what's the labor force aspect here?
It's a very interesting question, because we have the technology change, which is actually replacing labor. In particular, it's replacing some immigrant labor as well. I go to the convenience store now, and there are a lot of electronic checkout places that never used to be there. This is just in the last year and a half or so. And the type of labor that they're replacing is actually, to a certain extent, immigrant labor. You used to go to the convenience stores, and half the people, at least behind the counters, at least in Tokyo, were these kids coming in from Asia. I went to one once. I couldn't quite understand what the young woman was saying, and so she started talking to me in English. She's a young Chinese girl who is, trilingual, and she's working at a convenience store in Tokyo. Now that they have those machines, that sort of worker is a little bit less necessary. Okay, so in that sense, the technology and the telework sort of stuff will reduce the need for labor, but it's not necessarily discriminatory against immigrant labor or any other kind of labor. It's just labor as a whole. That said, I also think that one of the things this technology does is it levels the playing field in gender discrimination issues quite substantially, because what matters is talent. And ability to use new technology is not something that has any particular gender aspects to it. So I actually think that the increased importance of technological sophistication is going to be a leveler in the issues of gender discrimination.
That's really interesting, and that also will a little bit depend on how we're going to open up, what's going to happen in schools, and whether maybe this telework is actually something that make men think twice about what they really want, and whether this whole communication and going, working late hours and so forth is really something that they want to return to. And then that's not so much a policy issue, but a negotiation with the employers.
Yes,
right?
and with the family.
Employers are fighting for talent, and so they can't really say no if the employees say we don't want to do this anymore. And I think some of this is already happening a little bit.
And some people,
although communication can be done through Zoom as well.
Yes.
All right. Let's have a quarantine. Before we do that, we can do one more question. Last question comes from Hiroki Takeuchi, our colleague at SMU. He wants to know a little bit more about should the government rescue companies? In what way, of wherever, whether it's a loan program or a subsidy or whatever. And Takeo, I think I heard you say that the government should rescue big companies, but maybe not small ones, or is that right? And also, how you mentioned the local restaurant and the omotenashi, and can we pay more? How could we save the social cohesion and the restaurants? And is there anything particular about Japan that would work well, as you were talking about?
I think we are in a crisis. So as long as we are in a crisis, we should help many companies and many workers so that they can tide over the crisis. But at the same time, as I said, we are expecting the economic system to change, economic structure to change in the near future. So we shouldn't try to protect the companies which will be, out of date soon. So that's something the government should be very careful not to save unviable companies. And for those, some companies may be able to survive with restructuring under court or not. And so any policies to make it easier to restructure, make it easier to change should be encouraged. Any policies that to prevent the necessary changes should be discouraged. So that should be the general rule.
I agree in general with what Takeo has said on this. One other thing that I think is quite interesting now is that the role of local governments in dealing with the crisis here in Japan has been quite interesting. And the notion that local governments can take individual initiatives to do things, I think has been given a great deal of credibility here. Governor Koike's actions in saying, no, we've got to stay home now, before Prime Minister Abe declared the national emergency, that I think was a huge step forward. And my observation, maybe the political scientists can help us understand this better, but my observation is that the higher you go up toward the national government, the more socialist things become. The more you get to the local level, the more, call it capitalist things become. So when the local governments are making decisions, they have to pay for stuff themselves. They ask the central government for money. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't come. But basically, if you have to make decisions, you're responsible for the fiscal part of it. And so the decisions become a little more market-oriented. So it really comes down to what the voters vote for. But if the central government maintains its control over the locals by giving them a lot of money and say, here, do this, then that basically sort of interdicts the local autonomy and the ability of individual prefectures to make decisions on their own, which I think would probably be bad for growth. This is a point actually made early on by none less than Edwin Reischauer, who said that one of the reasons that Japan developed earlier than other Asian countries was the strong local autonomy that was inherent in the Edo period economic system. And if we're seeing a little bit more of that come forward as a result of what Governor Koike and other governors have done, then I think that would be a good thing for the country.
That's a super interesting topic. We had this come up 10 days ago with Omori-san from MRI, who was here as a guest. And he said something very similar, that the regional revitalization may actually be a new thing after we're done with this. Whether that's, wage and price structures, as you said earlier, or also just people wanting to be out of Tokyo and live in less crowded places, or whether it's the political pull that the regions actually figure out what to do while the central government can't. Those are all super interesting topics that are.
A key thing on that is the transportation system, which is so heavily oriented toward Tokyo that it is a long, long way to get out to the regions. And if you want to go from region A to region B, you got to go through one of the centers. This doesn't work for regional revitalization. That's another.
There could be a lot of smart city work to be done. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. We're out of time. Before we leave, let me just bring my slide back up and remind our audience that we will be back next week. We have our own Dr. Kiyoizumi, who is a Tech Coast angel, which means he's an angel investor. And he'll talk about what the Tech Coast angels do to help startup companies in California survive this crisis. He'll be joined by Yuichiro Yoshinari, who is the director of MLab, which is an open innovation lab in Silicon Valley that is run by Mitsubishi Corp Americas. So I hope we'll see you all next week at the same time, and take good care and stay healthy. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.